So why don't we start off, the way I like to start every interview off, and feel free to go any direction you want, but I want to start off and just put the ball in your court and ask the question, tell me a little bit about you.
Okay, and I think I am who I am for two basic reasons. The Great Depression, growing up on a farm in Kentucky, living in a tenant house, being proud of it, with no foundation, cracks in the floor, no indoor water, no indoor toilet, no central heat, never knowing that that wasn't par for the course until, of course, I grew up and got older, and from 9 years of age, milked 12 or 15 cows night and morning before going to school, so that was my concentration, and I was failing out of school, certainly in high school completely. And then deciding after I turned 17 with World War II all around me, and all young men wanted to go in the military, and I decided I'd join the Marine Corps so I could sleep late. And I said that didn't work either, but that was a part of it. But growing up in that setting, proud of my parents, proud of everything about us, even though we had nothing, you know, we were poor folks and what have you. But my dad was a man of integrity, and my parents were honorable. They were people active in the church, active in the community. He was on the board of the Farm Land Bank. He didn't own anything at the time, you know. That, and then, subsequent to that, my 4 years in the United States Marine Corps. And if you're a Marine, you're proud the rest of your life that you're a Marine, because you never cease to be one. And a lot of people don't understand that, but every Marine understands it. Wherever we meet, under whatever circumstances, we have a common experience that we carry with us, and I don't know that I've ever found a Marine who was sorry he was a Marine, even though when he went in the Corps the first few months, he was sorry he was there. But once you get through it, you're proud of what you've accomplished. But I went from age 17, having literally failed high school here in LaGrange. I did get a certificate because the principal said, the Marine Corps can do you more good than we can, we'll give you a certificate. And I think I'm the only one probably who has a high school certificate out of the 8th grade at Ballardsville. I don't remember any of the rest of them. You know, we graduated from the 8th grade in cap and gown, because most of the country folks, that was real country at Ballardsville, all in that area. And most of our friends were tenant farmers. The few who owned the land, of course, employed all the other people to do that. But moving into the Marine Corps, took the test that you do to see what you wanted to do, asked if I could, my older brother had gone in and was an enlisted pilot in the Marine Corps, went overseas with a whole squadron of enlisted flyers, shot down a Zero and commissioned him, and he finally retired as lieutenant colonel after 20 years. Never finished, well, he finished high school, but he was a good student, but didn't go to college. But the Marine Corps sent me to the rifle range, and out of 600 men, I was the youngest and the smallest. I grew 4 inches taller the first 6 months of the Marine Corps. I was a runt. I was in a play of the 3 little men in school. And so after I did that so well with a rifle, and they kid me of using Kentucky windage, of course, they sent me off to gunnery school to be a tail gunner in dive bombers, while my fellow Marines went to Iwo Jima, and many of them were killed and wounded over there. And later, if you read my book, I had crashed on Iwo and almost got killed in an airplane. But after that, then I went later to Okinawa and was in the combat there and in the occupation of Japan. But I moved from, during those 4 years, to sergeant. Had troops when I was 20 years old that I commanded. Talked earlier about growing up, maturing, being responsible. The expectation of the Marine Corps for its enlisted men was high. You had to do what you were expected to do. And so I've always said, and it was clear it is even today, if you spend a period of time in the military, you get matured way beyond kids in college. They may get intellectually ahead of you, but your maturity, the wisdom that goes with it. And then as we all came out, say 4 years later and went to college, it was a job to do and we did it seriously. So those are the foundations of whatever successes I've had. And then the discipline of growing up on the farm. My dad, we had to work all the time. We worked summer, morning, night. And today, I can't wait to get up in the morning to do something. My whole family will tell you that. And so it set the stage for mine. I'd been the brightest guy in the world, or the most knowledgeable, even though I went through and got a PhD degree. I still say my dad knew more with his grade school education than I have with a PhD. In many ways, that's true. But the fact, with all of that behind me, and the determination after I had matured those 4 years and had the GI Bill, and that was the essence of all us World War II vets. We had that GI Bill. So we thought we'd give it a try. We'll probably flunk out, you know. But I went to that little school that let me in, and I'm still on that board, and I'm a grand supporter and honorary campaign chair right now for a major campaign, because it took me in when I needed it, and they needed me because they needed students, so they let veterans come in, unlike Georgetown and others who wouldn't let them in because they weren't qualified. Campbellsville will take you in and qualify you. That 2 years was the foundation of my moving to Vanderbilt and succeeding. And I was teaching at Vanderbilt before I finished my senior year because they had a professor drop out and asked me to take over 2 courses, which I hadn't even taken. So those opportunities of having to stretch myself to the maximum to fit in and to be successful. And of course, I married a wife as a freshman, had 6 kids before I finished graduate school, so I had to be ambitious, and I had to work, and I had to sustain myself. So all of those things that you can say, man, life is difficult, were the foundation that makes life at 86 today so pleasant, because I can look back and say, I'm a happy guy and healthy guy at this age. And while I was a runt back then, you know, I'm not so old at this age. I'll give you a little time built onto that, I think. Well, I've told you a lot more about why I think I might have been successful than maybe you wanted to know. But I think it's those foundation circumstances that while you're there, you know, I was self-conscious of my lack. I had no money when I was in high school. I remember going to the Fat Cattle Show, and my dad gave me a quarter. And one of my fellow students borrowed it from me, and to this day, he's never paid it back, and I've never forgotten that. You know, that's how stringent we were. We couldn't buy light bread. We had flour, and we made biscuits. But I don't look back in any sense of shame with that. But back then, I remember some of my fellow students brought light bread to school, and I had biscuits and jelly, and you kind of hid around to eat them. But that's immaturity. You grow up and you say, well, that was an experience that gave me an inner strength to endure in spite of the circumstance of wherever you are at whatever time in life you might be. You know, I'm not intimidated by somebody having $2 billion. All I want is the opportunity to be successful and to work and to be fulfilled. And so you get over all that business of being just like this person or just like that person. Be who you are. And I think you have to go through certain things to really learn that. Yeah. And then it becomes nature's second level of who you are, so you don't really worry too much about it. Again, I've expanded. I told you to have to edit my tape there.
Oh, that's one of the most perfect answers to that open-ended question, I think. I think that's the point of the question, and so you answered it right on. But I do want to I want to talk about your experience as a veteran, but let's go back to LaGrange, or Ballardsville, right? Where the farm was?
Yeah.
Well, what kind of farm did you grow up on?
I grew up in a house right on the rise in the middle of Ballardsville. If you got beyond Ballardsville, there was a paved road to LaGrange. There was a rock road to Shelbyville. And it was a muddy road, we'd break through the rocks, because I remember getting stuck in our Model T Ford and having to turn around and back up a hill from Ballardsville to Shelbyville. And it was wilderness out there, you know, it really was. And then we got to where the old Baptist church was, and it's where the new one is now, and the old one burned down, and I was a janitor there when I was 15. And the road then to Eminence was also a rock road. And I remember when they rocked it, it was a mud road, and they had big car tracks. You'd get stuck going to Eminence from Ballardsville. Then I remember when they rocked it, and then I remember grading it, because I became friendly with one of the grader drivers and spent the night with him one time on the grader. I'll never forget that. And so that was the area. It was utterly rural, and I say for $1.98 I could have bought Ballardsville. I should have done it, but didn't have the $1.98, so you don't do those sorts of things. But anyway, Dad and Mother and the 4 of us children and my grandmother lived in the tenant house in Ballardsville. That's what I was talking about, right in the house on a little crest there. Then walked to the dairy barn a mile. And you know, back then it would get 0 weather here in this country. I don't know why it doesn't much of that anymore. We would get up every morning at 3:30 or 4 and walk a mile to the Davis farm, which was down on Floyd's Fork right near the creek. My dad ran the dairy of 40-some cows. He and the 3 of us boys, from the time we were 9 years old until we left home, we milked those cows for a long time by hand, and I said 12 or 15 every night and every morning before school. Then we'd come home and Mother would have a platter of eggs and oatmeal and biscuits, and then we'd catch a school bus from the, well, this is later, we moved in the house on the farm. We'd catch a school bus then after I got to LaGrange to ride to LaGrange, and then I'd sleep most of the day, and then we'd go home and go to milk those cows again, and then go to bed and get up at 4 o'clock the next morning and do it. We did that from age 9 to 17. Now you talk about the laws governing how children are made to work. I've often said, out of the goodness of my dad, I never would accuse him of anything, because these were Depression years. If we hadn't done this, we'd have been taking government grants, and my dad would never take a penny from the government. A lot of people in Ballardsville, they'd come home with the baskets full of groceries the government gave them. My dad he was just disdainful of that. He would never do that. So he always worked, always had a job. He made $1 a day and a gallon of milk, and we could kill a hog and a beef in the summertime, and we had a garden, and we lived on that.
That's incredible.
And we boys, now he didn't let us off without pay. He paid us, and we kept records, a half a penny for every cow we milked. And so at the end of the month, sometime we may have $4 coming. But guess what? We had to buy our own clothes. We learned the value of $1. And I still have a hard time spending more than $1 on anything. You know, you never quite get over that. But these are literally the remembrances, but they're reality at that time. And of course, sharing that with my children and grandchildren, that they can't quite comprehend all that, but it's true.
And that's important to keep in mind, because I mean that had an amazing impact on your work ethic later in life. And I think, you know, we do have to think about that with you know, generation. I've got small children, and I certainly did not grow up on a farm, and grew up in a very sort of comfortable setting. And I think at that point, the work ethic is really something that you have to learn externally, and I'm not sure it's as effective when
No, if it's not as effective if you make do. If you have to, as we did, it was reality. Mm-hmm. And you know, it was 1933 or 4 that Kentucky Rural Electric came through Ballardsville. I remember coming home from school, and there was a bulb hanging down from each of the 4 rooms in the house, right in the middle of we had electricity. And Dad bought a Zenith radio with a big dial. Seems like it was $12.95 or something like that. And we would sit at night and watch it just like you watch TV and listen to Amos and Andy and all those old programs. I have that Zenith radio today and it's still working.
Wow, that's fantastic. Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of radio, you know, you're a hardworking farm boy at this point, and you're seven. You know, I'm trying to do the math, but I know you went into the Marines at 17, right?
Right.
So, talk about your awareness of World War II before Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
What were you what were we thinking about as a country?
On the radio, now that we had a radio, after the war started in Europe, I remember clearly the news coming off of the radio every morning at breakfast time and so forth, how many planes had gone from England over Germany and how many were shot down. They're talking about, 1,000 bombers going over and maybe 200 were shot down. It's hard to comprehend today when we say, we got 3 people killed over in Afghanistan. We would have hundreds of airmen killed. People, our family, every family had somebody that went down somewhere. And of course, later we had my own brother out there flying. But the radio was full of the war and the politics. And of course, I didn't think much about the politics then, but I remember hearing of Roosevelt being unwilling to, the country didn't want him to go to war. Democrats didn't want to go to war. I guess some of the hard-nosed Republicans probably did. And so that went on, and then then the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. That changed the mind of the whole country. I was 13 when the owner of the farm where I was milking morning and night, I was carrying a bucket of milk out of the, and they say when I started milking at age 9, I would milk the bucket full, somebody else have to carry it out for me. I wasn't big enough to, after I poured it in, to carry it. When I was carrying it down, I was 15 then. And the owner of the farm came into the milk house and said, the Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor. This was a Sunday afternoon. I remember it vividly. I thought to myself, what country is Pearl Harbor? Never heard of Pearl Harbor. And that's true, out there somewhere. Well, in a few days, I began to realize, hearing all of the radio commentation and people talking. If you walked into a store, they're chatting about the war. And then the radio announcing that the young men were lining up to get in the military to go fight. And at 15, here I'm thinking, boy, I wish I were old enough to do that, because the fever immediately. These foreigners have attacked our country after I learned what Pearl Harbor was all about, and our ships and our planes and our people, how many thousand were killed, a couple of thousand, I guess. And so the fever started with me right there. My older brother, as soon as he turned 17, get away from those cows, he joined the Marine Corps. That was 1941, before the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. And I was fascinated, but he came home on furlough in his uniform and so forth. And he was a corporal, 2-striper. He was a good high school student, flying in a transport plane. But the Marine Corps, as soon as the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, judged it had to build an air wing of some strength because it didn't have a lot of that. So they took some of these kids with high school degrees. A lot of Marines didn't have high school degrees. And he happened to be one of them, a half dozen, sent him to Pensacola, the Naval Pre-Flight School. And I think he went through pre-flight in 5 months. They sent him to California, and they were all enlisted, because they were enlisted when they went there. They weren't officers. And went to El Toro, formed a squadron, gave them further training, put them aboard the transport, took them South Pacific, gave them a Corsair, and shortly thereafter he went out, shot down a Jap Zero, and they commissioned him. That was the nature. Now you could imagine back home, here I am. I remember the Courier-Journal had headlines in the Sunday paper. I remember exactly. State Flyer Bag Zero acting as a lure to guns. That was my brother. I still have that article. Well, from that moment forward, I couldn't wait to be a Marine. And I hoped I could fly. And of course, with my terrible high school record, I wasn't going to fly, but they did put me into gunnery because I was real good at that, and that was what was important. So by the time then that I was a year and a half so later, 17, the fever was in me as it was, I would say 98% of all the young men in our country wanted to be in the military, and overwhelmingly there 16 million of them, no women in those days except nurses. And so almost everybody on every corner and every family had somebody. My mother had all three of her sons in the military. All came back. Uncanny. But I think the word fever is appropriate. There was a fever in the country to live for your country with a willingness to die because of the life it provided for you. And I mean, we were deeply sincere. And so we all went off. Some didn't come back. Most did come back. Some were wounded. Others of us had the good fortune of that experience, which today is the most vivid experience in one's lifetime. Just think, going through at 17 years old, I got on the troop train down at 12th Street Station in Louisville. Took a whole trainload of Marines to be. And there were a lot of other servicemen in there who already been battling everything. And I remember here, I'm a rural Kentucky Baptist, raised in this atmosphere, don't drink, don't smoke, don't dance. I mean, all this was a part of the culture of a Baptist in the Ballardsville and the community. I get on that train and the guys are shooting craps, cursing. I thought to myself, what happened to this, all these people? And I'd write to my mother about some of these things. And in my book, I think I cite the fact that the culture of the Marine Corps I had to adjust to because it wasn't going to adjust to me. But for 4 years then, I went to church with Jews and Catholics, and I was in foxholes and airplanes with everybody under the sun thinking, and there were black platoons and white platoons in the Marine Corps when I was in there. I had a buddy in my tent with me who was from Athens, Georgia, and he said, I hate niggers. He did. I'd say, Jerry, they're human beings just like, ain't no human being I know is a nigger. I went through some of that stuff. My father, because on the farm we had black men working with my dad doing the same job. If we'd ever said anything negative about a black man, he'd have whaled the tire out of us. So we grew up without ever thinking about prejudice. But I learned that, and then I learned the liberal up Eastern, and one of my close buddies has flunked out of Princeton, and the others, one of them was down here in Kentucky. He's now a doctor in Louisville. There were 4 of us who after boot camp went to gunnery school. To tell you just a fraction about that. The one who dropped out of Princeton after the war went back to Princeton, became vice president of a big insurance company. Ray Potts, who was from Cedar Dam down here in western Kentucky. He came back, went to U.of.L., became a medical doctor, and he and I are still in touch with him. He's in Louisville. And the other one became the head of a big farm instrument company up in Illinois. I had them all to come to Richmond after I was president of the university for a weekend. And so one of them said, you know why we came back, don't you, Heilman? I said, no. I said, we wanted to see what this old boy from the hayfield got to be a university president. Well, this is the kind of way we reverted back to being kids in the Marine Corps. And then, by the way, when I just returned on my 86th birthday with that 9,200-mile trip this summer, I stopped in Connecticut and visited with a fellow Marine I hadn't seen in 65 years. Most of them are all deceased now, but That's elaborating beyond your question.
No, but I mean, I think it's right on, because one of the things I'd like to get is this idea of, you were open to this whole new world, pretty much instantaneously.
Transformed my whole mind,
my
whole being.
And your brother, too. I'm thinking about your brother, who had the same upbringing as you. Unlike kids today, unlike us, who travel the world, air travel wasn't very common, and suddenly
troop ships was common.
Suddenly he's in a plane, and he's, and you have to think about that moment where you might not have you were probably never ever in a plane at that point.
Never been in a plane. I'd say to people, it's probably true, I'd still been milking cows today if it hadn't been for World War II and the Marine Corps.
You think we would have gone into the war without something like Pearl Harbor?
Ultimately, I think we would have had to, but that made it so crystal clear. And I had a letter from what was her name? She's from LaGrange, Klosterman. She was in school with my brother. She lives in Texas now, but she married a Marine during World War II or shortly thereafter, and they were in England, as my brother was, and they met in England, the other Marine and my brother, flying with the RAF. And she got to know my brother well after he was mature. I had a letter from her not many months ago down in Texas saying she'd read something about me somewhere. She said, I just want to let you know that having grown up in Oldham County in LaGrange, knowing your family, said it's a miracle that from that rural family would be a lieutenant colonel in the Marine Corps, 20 years, and a university president. Well, it is unique. It's, again, a part of the tenor of our society and country and the circumstance of the moment. Most of us are a result of our place in history, not a result even of our ambition. We need to be ambitious, but the ambition is to walk through the next door. But time and circumstance takes care of the rest of it. But if you don't walk through that door, you've missed it. And that's what I see my life more than anything else, because I never dreamed of being a college university president. I majored in accounting only because they said you have to have a major, and somebody told me what accounting was. I said, sounds like something I ought to be able to do. Ain't end up being a university and college president, but it's because I was a chief financial officer, was in a public accounting firm, and I moved as I did my job, others would say, you ought to do this, or you have the capacity to do that, and so you move. And unlike our president said recently, I still think the government doesn't do it for us. You pretty much do it on our own, Now, the highway's there, and we're glad the government provided it.
Well, and let's talk about that, because the one thing that the government did do at that point that transformed that generation was the GI Bill.
Oh, and listen, nothing the government's ever done can surpass the GI Bill. Yeah. Without that, without World War II, I'd never have gone to college. Nobody in my household ever mentioned. I didn't know what college was. But without the GI Bill, there was no way I could have even dreamed of going to college. And the whole idea of the GI Bill inspired the idea, not just funded it, but inspired it because, well, if there are other veterans going, of course we youngsters also recognize that our officers were generally educated people. And we enlisted, we had our own opportunities for leadership, but there was a point beyond which we would, and I'm sure my brother retired from the Marine Corps as lieutenant colonel because he didn't have a college education. He couldn't be a full colonel or general because he was an outstanding Marine. Opportunities come out of recognition that you have had ambition to a certain level, and your ambition can carry you to another level, and it's not always intellect. Intelligence and knowledge, and I frequently admit to people, I'm not the most knowledgeable person in the world, but I am a person that got a lot of wisdom. I know how to deal with people At least there's evidence that I do. I've gotten along for 21 years leading college and universities and been in senior positions all of my life for 56 years. So relationships, the knowledge of the human heart and mind and soul, passion, all those things, you have to build those natural attributes with an educational filter. I mean, you got to keep your mind moving. But there's different levels of mental capacity, and I don't have the greatest one, and I know it. I don't need to have. But I have advanced far beyond a lot of my friends who are a lot more intelligent than I am. And I can see their flaws, and sometimes it's because they're more intelligent than they ought to be. It carries them to a level of belief in themselves beyond reality.
Well, let's get back to the GI Bill, but before we do that, I want to go back to when you were, that the time period between Pearl Harbor and when let's talk about enlisting and going through boot camp and training and taking that.
Well, after the Pearl Harbor incident, and I knew about that, was too young to go in, I tried to enlist in the Marine Corps at age 16. And that was what most young men, again, we wanted to go. This day and time, young people they can't comprehend that. The spirit was, I'll die for my country if I have to, but I want to be there. And our parents, you don't want to do that, you get killed over there. Well, so why did you join the Marine Corps? And I want to tell you something I just read that reinforces why I joined the Marine Corps. I saw an article recently of a young man was wanting to go in the military, so he went to the Army, and they said, well, you come join the Army, you get education, you get this, that, and the other. Went to the Navy, and they said, well, you could go with us, you got a white sheet sleep on aboard ship. So he went over to the Marine sergeant and said, what's a Marine? He said, we're the ones that go in first, come out last, and do what nobody else wants to do. He said, that's for me. That was the spirit. I wasn't looking for clean sheets. I wasn't looking for the GI Bill, which I got. I wanted to be in the forefront of the battle against our enemy. And that was the spirit of the young men of World War II. We didn't want to die, but we knew we might, and we never gave it a second thought. And I think that was the magnanimous impression of the young men, and that's true of the 16 million, the million living today out of that 16 million. They're all proud that was the way they felt, and they still feel that way. They'd still die for their country, and it's the most pride they take in anything that they served. And I think that's why there's kind of a nobility. I'm not citing this as personal, but as a group. That exist, and when people say to us, and they do everywhere, and we're proud of this fact, we appreciate your service. Even the young warriors of today, when they talk to me, they say, they may be in Afghanistan or Iraq, or even the guys from Vietnam, and I'll say, look, your service is just as important as mine. Yeah, but you guys had it tough. Well, they've watched all these films over the years, the World War II Marines and sailors and airmen and otherwise, and they have an impression some way that we set the stage for everything. Well, we did for them because it's the only thing they really knew, and it gives them pride in what they do as a result, but they think it sort of follows our leadership. And it makes us proud today, obviously, because what do you have to be proud of other than what you did or didn't do? And what you didn't do, you can be proud of, as well as what you did. So all those things are factors. And as I work with veterans, this inspires me to continue to work with them because I see all of this, and I see these old timers, and most of the remaining million are older than I am because I'm one of the younger ones. And so I see one example. I was traveling through North Dakota on my Harley, and I stopped at a McDonald's. And I saw an old guy over in the corner, and I went over and said, you look like a guy might have served in World War II. That's the way I'd Yeah, Dad served in the Navy. And then he started telling me a story about he was in the Navy for 4 years. The war started. He'd gotten out. They called him back in, and then he served, I don't know, 4 or 5 years, and got out. And then he was a mechanic. He didn't go to college. He told me all the things he did. And he married. His wife passed away. He had a son. Then he had a partner, he said, for 12 years. Then she died. And I listened to all that. That's what I wanted. And when I finished, I said, I'm passing through, and I'm the national spokesperson for the Greatest Generation Foundation. I'm talking to veterans, just want to get your impression. He said, you're the first person since I got out of the Navy that's ever mentioned my service. And he was proud, man, he just let it all out. I imagine his wife, she didn't want to hear it. His kids weren't that interested. Now your grandkids, they become more interested. My grandkids are very interested in my service. But your wife relations, your kids, you know, you're raising them, that's a very different kind of thing. They hear this, just one more thing, telling them what to do or how to do it and that type of thing. So it's a very interesting point in life when you reflect back, and that's what I'm doing, expanding beyond that, elaborating. I may have forgotten what your question was, but it was about what we were thinking of. Oh, where I went from. Well, I went got that train ride across country. By the time I got to California 4 days later, the windows were open on the train. They were belching smoke. It was all coming in. We had, some of us had white shirts on. We had soot all over. We were black. We arrived in San Diego at about 4 o'clock in the morning. That's the way the Marine Corps does things. We got off of, had a bus train, and we got to the base, and get out of this bus and get onto those yellow footprints, and boy, they started bellowing their stuff at us and took us in with, made us get rid of everything out of our pockets, and then shaved our head, and they're doing all this, and we're all sleepy and ready to go to bed. So we did this, I don't know, maybe it was 2 o'clock in the morning. By 4 o'clock, they let us go to bed. And 5 o'clock, they woke us up. And we were up until 10 o'clock the next night. And that's the way it went. And they had cut the training time down to 8 weeks because we had just been through Tarawa, Guadalcanal. In fact, our DI had just come back from Guadalcanal. He was a 5-stripe sergeant. And I remember him saying this, and he called us, you sons of bitches. It really shook us all up, us rural Kentucky. You sons of bitches, if you don't learn to stick that bayonet in that dummy, some Jap's gonna stick one in your tummy. And he was right back from the war. And we knew we were going. So that's how vivid it was. Even today, I wonder how, when you're training in the military, you can really take it seriously, unless you know you're gonna be there. So we worked at it. We want to protect ourselves. Well, anyway, we managed to get through boot camp. And I remembered I wrote a letter to my father, which now the Virginia War Memorial has. And I said, dear Dad, this was 4 days. I've been here 4 days, and I've learned one thing. I should have stayed home. And of course, that made him feel good. He wanted me to go anyway. So I went in at 17 when I couldn't get in at 16 with his approval. And so after boot camp, as I said, on the rifle range, I was one of the top performers. We had the old M1 rifle, and you shot for a score of 340, a perfect score. Offhand, kneeling, prone, and I scored 323 out of 340, and that is high. So when I decided what I was going to do, rather than send me to Camp Pendleton for further training for the next invasion, which was Iwo Jima, they sent me off to Memphis to the Naval Air Technical Training Center, and I spent 6 months there. Radio, radar. Radar was in a big area surrounded by barbed wire. It was new stuff. It was great secret stuff back then. But those of us who were going to fly in the rear seat of a dive bomber, we had radar, we had a 50-gallon machine gun, we had semi-4 flags, we'd flash out the window to the plane next to us for a ship and hand signals. We learned all that stuff. Morse code in a period of 6 months. So I found out for the first time in my life that if you really want to learn, you can learn, because I wanted to learn. So I came out very high on the list of all of the guys that were there. And because training to be a tail gunner, we used 12-gauge shotgun shooting at clay pigeons. I remember my score was 99 out of 100. You know, follow those things, shoot them. So I'm just sharing all the many things. Think of a kid in the civilian life who never, the many things we got to do, you'd never dream of doing. And this challenge and the competition, and yet it was friendly competition. You know, our buddies, one of us would say, well, I got my grade today and it wasn't this, somebody else failed it. And so you all work with each other, helping each other do these things. Then after I finished that, went back to San Diego, Marine Air Base there. And they would call out everybody out of the barracks every morning and call out names to get aboard ship and go somewhere into war. I couldn't wait to go. I remember I had a tooth that needed to be filled, so it put me off a few weeks. And finally got to think, Phil, we stood for about 3 days in a line to get on a troop ship in San Diego. You know, war is mostly waiting. And you line up and then they'd wait, we're not going to sail till tomorrow, and then go through all that stuff. You're ready to go. Got on the ship, 600 men in the hull of a troop ship for 56 days en route to battle. Well, they had, you know, we had boxing exercise on the main deck and all that sorts of things. But the only music we had, I had a harmonica, and I could play a harmonica. And they'd say, Heilman, play that tune. Here we're down in this big hole, you know, hot as a blue place. They had a big thing with air, blowing air down in that hole so we could all breathe up on deck. A lot of us sleep up on deck. But here we were 56 days getting acquainted, ready to go to battle. And then we had a submarine attack. This was one thing I always dread down that hole. We get some torpedo through here and we can't get out, you know, drown, and we all worried about that. Anyway, the big sub chasers dropped their big stuff all around. I was on fantail. The Marines actually were assigned duties at that time. And so I got my first taste of battle and chasing a submarine. And we would have some days 40 ships around us. The next day we might be all alone out in the vast ocean. And the next day we may have a carrier and a cruiser. And the next day we may have 3 transports. But that's why it took so long. They just dodged every way to keep subs from bothering us. Then we came into the Bay of Okinawa where the suicide planes were coming in. So while we were in there, of course, they were diving mainly on the carriers and the battleships, but they weren't immune to get into troop ship because they know where we were headed to. So we all kidded about the fact we wanted to go ashore where it was safe because we couldn't dig a foxhole in that steel deck. And so we made each other delighted with our own banter about all that kind of stuff, you know.
Was this the initial invasion of Okinawa?
No, this was not the initial invasion. The initial troops, when they hit the beach, the Japanese weren't there defending, you know, unlike Iwo Jima. They had backed up, had holes in all the hills. So we came in later, landed on the same beach, went over the side and landing craft, but we didn't know that. Mm-hmm. When they sent us, so we know whether we're going into a new beach, you don't know what you're going into, so you're both in anticipation as a trained Marine. Of course, you want to go, but your anxiety is a pretty high level too, and your heart beats fast. So they said, well, carry enough rations for 2 nights. We'll hit the beach, dig foxholes. We don't know who we'll encounter there. And so we all went in, and then I was assigned to an air wing, and they had built a new strip, the CBs, which are a great group of people, with all of their road building equipment, had ground out between 2 mountains a flat surface and put some kind of coral on the strip. So our aircraft were flown in there, and then I marched across the island through the battle zones to this new strip and was assigned to my responsibility there in identifying the Japanese planes coming in and identifying our planes coming in so we didn't shoot ours down and let theirs come and bomb us, and they were coming in with suicide missions and all.
How do you differentiate? I mean, at that point, what was the method of differentiating friend or?
Oh, we had equipment we called IFF, identification friend or foe. We sent out a signal, and that signal would come back to us, or our planes would send a signal to our tower. I was the communications there. It would tell us this is one of our planes coming in. In fact, the F-7F Tiger Cat, which may not mean much to you, twin-engine night fighter, came in very late in the war, but just before the war ended, and a whole squadron of those dudes came in, and I had not been appraised. I was about to get them shot down. They were strange planes coming in, and we had to be awfully careful because the Japanese tried to mimic our aircraft so they could get in, and of course they were all intent on suicide, so they weren't worried about getting out. They just wanted to do something bad while they were there. They had a whole group of them to land on our strip and jump out with knives and start slicing up our aircraft. Of course, they knew they were going to be killed, and all of us rounded up weapons and saw that they were killed. They were buried. I've got pictures of burying them with bulldozers and so forth, but those were all of the...
And when they were slicing, were they cloth on the...
Yeah, well, you know, the aircraft is heavy cloth on some of the controls on the fighter planes and so forth. Very tightly built and glued over and over and over, but you can slice up that sort of stuff, jamming. But they were, any way they could disrupt what we were doing. By that time, they pretty much knew we were going to win the war. We didn't know. That's why we dropped the bomb. We thought it would go on. Mm-hmm. My outfit was on Okinawa, planned for landing on the mainland of Japan 6 weeks after the day the bomb was dropped. I was on radio watch at 4 o'clock in the morning down under a concrete installation when I received on shortwave radio the fact that we had dropped a big bomb on a Japanese city, and the Japanese were saying that we had destroyed their hospitals, you know, a terrible sort of thing. To me, I thought, man, if this thing is this vicious, maybe we get this war over. Of course, all of us ambitious to fight, we're just as ambitious to get the war over. Once you get into it, you want to get it over with. You're still willing to die, but you think maybe I get through it and I don't have to die. All of us who were planning to go on that invasion, I can assure you, every one of us thought we were going to die. I did. I didn't expect to come out of that alive.
What was your level of awareness of, Okinawa, before you got on, was one of the more, at least in the Pacific Theater, one of the more...
It was when it's really analyzed, one of the most vicious of all. Sugarloaf Hill, and I had a couple of buddies on Sugarloaf Hill. They took that hill 12 times, I believe, the Japanese. They were all in like a swarm of bees under that thing. You'd go up this side, and they'd come up the other, and then they'd come back on this side. And I went back there years later to see them plowing down Sugarloaf Hill and getting all the stuff under, the old weapons under there and everything like that. But 2,500 deaths a day for 4 months on that island.
That's incredible.
It was vicious.
What was your level of awareness of that as a sort of incoming young soldier being deployed for the first time? What was your level of awareness of?
Well, I was not aware of the incident of how many and that type thing, because each of us, certainly at my level as a enlisted person, I was getting communication passing on, but that wasn't the kind of communication was coming in. It was more dealing with how many Japanese planes might have, when our planes were going out, who was coming in. We have, for example, the kind of atmosphere. In the evenings, we had a big screen, and we'd unroll the screen, and we had movies they'd send over to us. We'd sit out here in the open and watch movies, and then we'd get a notice the Japanese are coming, we'd turn off the movie and all of us go crawl in a hole somewhere. And after they left, we go back and watch a movie. I mean, that's kind of an atmosphere it was. Our food services were 2x4s with tarpaulins over the top and mosquito netting around the side. That's the kind of facilities we had. And we were in a more secure area, even though we left. We would go out on patrol, all of us, take our rifles, small arms, and find the stragglers, and then the main group was always moving forward with the big guns, that type thing. So we always knew generally what was going on, but we didn't get evidence every day that today we had 2,500 killed. When the war ended, and after I got that notice, then 2 days later, that morning, I wrote a little note to my mother about what I had heard, but I didn't mail it. Then 2 days later, the other bomb was dropped, and I finished the letter. And it had raindrops on it because it was raining and muddy over there. You couldn't keep anything dry. But the day then that they announced, and I said, well, hopefully this war will be over soon. Well, and the day later we got the word, or I don't remember the exact day, that the war, they accepted our terms. We had 6 killed, and I still have the little sheet of paper that was dispersed to the troops, mimeographed, I guess. 6 troops killed yesterday from the celebration. We were firing everything into the air, and there were people being killed, but all coming back down. And the guys went nuts to think, we thought we were going to go into Japan, fight that battle, and be killed, and all of a sudden with those bombs, we weren't. The emotion that you don't even know is there. The guys on Guam, even some of the other islands, they went nuts. And that was the kind of atmosphere that prevailed.
Did you all have a sense while you were there that, what was going on in Berlin?
Oh yeah, we kept up with the news, but not as vivid. When I was, of course, growing up in the States, we had a radio right there at home. We didn't concentrate because the European battle by that time was substantially finalized, and we knew what was going to happen there. Mm-hmm. We didn't know what was going to happen in Japan. We didn't know those scrappers would ever give up. And we expected 1 million of our own men. I'm talking about from that time in history. We were there. We were going to be a part of it. We expected 1 million of us to be killed and 4 million. I mean, we talked these terms, Japanese as a minimum. And then, would we still be able to contain them? They were going to meet us on the beaches with poison sticks. They told us all this stuff.
I mean, that was really, the sense for the justification of the bombs in the first place.
Yeah, oh, absolutely.
So you all had that kind of it's easy for historians to look back and say that, but you all had an awareness that an invasion of Japan was going to be long,
it was going to be a necessary disaster.
Yeah.
It was. I mean, when you're going in to finalize the war that you think is going to take place for the next 18 months, and you're going to be there, you're thinking, well, I won't really be there 18 months. Somebody's got to go, and I'm going to be up front. And the troop ships, the actual time of the landing, a typhoon came through. You heard of the divine wind, haven't you? We would have been on troop ships, probably would devastate us. And it would have probably been a disaster. We wouldn't have, either couldn't have landed, wouldn't have landed, or would have been there. And half of us blown away. Even after that, I went from Okinawa to Tokyo on a troop ship after the war ended. We hit a typhoon. That ship literally would go under and come up, and all of the little boats that you get rest, they all washed away. The sailors were all sick. I can remember being so sick, I didn't care whether it came up or not. You can be that sick.
Yeah.
You don't want any more of that. And that thing would turn practically upside down. And that's when Nimitz lost a ship or two, a couple broke up. And I was out in one of those.
Amazing.
Talk about experiences. Those, many times people talk about, what'd you do in combat? And I say, well, that was one part of it. But being in the Marine Corps 4 years, I had a variety of instances where death occurred in accidents of many kinds. In automobiles, on trucks, in aircraft. So you're put in a circumstance where your risks are essential to results that you're shooting for. You know, you can say, well, I was going to go to New York today, the weather's bad, don't think I'll fly. Well, after the war even, when I was assigned as a radio operator on the staff ship of the commander of the 5th Fleet, of all things, an all-Marine crew. We had a twin-engine R-4D. We had a place to cook. We had a place for the admiral to sleep. We took intelligence people to Hiroshima, Nagasaki. That's why I got to go to all those places. And, you know, if the weather might have been terrible, overcast, bad, you need to fly down to Okinawa or over to Iwo Jima or to Guam. We'd take off. Sometime when we came back, Mount Fuji, 12,000 feet, and we were flying at 6,000, and the coastline was maybe 2,000, and we were down below the coastline under the clouds trying to find our way back. And I think about those things. It wasn't that we didn't think about them. I remember standing behind a second lieutenant flying that thing. He was about as green as I was, and he was probably 21, and I was 19. I had his earphones, one on ear, his signal coming in from the strip, and over here, I don't know what, but he was listening to two different things trying to land that plane. We came down on GCA, ground controlled approach radar. It was snowing. The runway, this was right outside Tokyo. The runway was covered. The clouds were, I don't know, 100 feet. We broke through the clouds, hit the runway, and the runway looked just like the clouds because it was white, without ever having seen it, and just pure luck. But I remember the sweat rolling down his sweat. I'll never forget that. Well, it caused me to sweat too, but those were the kind of things that you don't hear much about. And this was after the war. But finally, all of the occupation stuff, we had Marines killed, cut up and placed on a railroad track. I'm sure the Japanese were doing it. Didn't have much of that, but we get up in the morning and get word about those things.
So just when you think, you know, the risk is over, you know, it's not.
No, it's not over till it's over.
Talk about one of those instances, the plane. You had an incident with the plane, right, where there was a crash, right?
Yes.
Talk about that.
On Iwo Jima. I had flown on the admiral's plane to Guam, which was about probably a 10-hour flight. We had a big tank in the plane. We could fly for that long from Tokyo. We were having it reconstituted, I don't know, with a new engine or something. So they had to go keep it for several days or weeks. So we commandeered space on an Army transport. And between Guam and Okinawa, you'd land or maybe refuel on Iwo. So we landed on Iwo and were there overnight. The next morning, we got up. It was heavy winds. And we had a whole group of intelligence officers. On this one, I was a kind of rider, extra rider. I was back on the back seat, safest place to be, of course. And we took off down the runway, and of course, the Iwo had the one runway, one direction. You couldn't fly like you can to a big airport again into the wind. We were flying with the wind on the side. Because I was the loader as a radio operator on my plane, I had a slide rule to load. Airplanes don't fly out of balance. You know, most people don't realize every once in a while you get on a plane and say, somebody move back here. You got to have a balance in an aircraft. We had one a couple of years ago in Charlotte, 3 or 4 years ago, to crash. Remember, it did that. This was the same nature. Well, these intelligence officers, some high-ranking officers, they had heavy gear. They threw it on the tail of the plane. Nobody checked the load. So we took off, and the plane went up probably 50 feet in the air, and a crosswind hit it, and he was already out of balance. He just rolled over right into the deck. 99 times out of 100, it would have burst into flames, and everybody would have been killed. Well, it broke apart, didn't break into flames. I don't remember how many. I don't think anybody was killed, and I don't remember how seriously, because shortly thereafter, I got another plane went to Tokyo. But I wrote my mother a letter shortly thereafter, said almost, I don't remember exactly what I said, but I didn't tell her quite as serious as it was to me. But I realized I had survived what few others would ever survive. And, but you got right back on the plane, kept going. And all the pilots during World War II, those things were happening all the time, you know.
Mm-hmm. Luck does play a part, doesn't it?
Yeah.
You know,
and you realize today, people who fly these big planes, they train all the time, and they train, you know, they may be 35 or 40 years of age before they ever fly a big transport. Well, these kids, 21, 22 second lieutenants flying bombers, 4-engine bombers, that was essential. I mean, that's the way it was. And so you live like that. A lot of lives were lost. And what was this young second lieutenant to do when he didn't know anything? He did the smart, he cut the engines. And, but after I looked at the plane up front, the propellers were all bent around backwards because they had dug right into the ground, you know. But he had cut the engine. It's probably why it didn't catch on fire. Mm-hmm. But I don't know whatever happened to that second lieutenant. I doubt if he flew much anymore after that, but because he was responsible, even though somebody else failed to do the loading of that plane. But those are.
Are you okay to are you okay to continue?
Oh, I'm all right.
Okay, because what I want to do is move into talking about Hiroshima and your time there and those initial impressions. But you heard it on the radio. We talked about that. You heard that it was a single bomb. You'd seen cities who had thousands of bombs. You know, let's talk about sort of. Was there any awareness of what it really was at that point?
Well, there wasn't, except as you could visualize that someone said, even the enemy said, this big bomb destroyed. The destruction was great. I could tell that. And of course, propaganda would cause them to say they destroyed our hospitals because that was inhumane. But then in a few days, we had the word that this one bomb had destroyed the whole city. And that's why almost immediately, before the second one was dropped, and then of course they still didn't surrender, we were all thinking, maybe this leads toward the end of the war. We didn't have any idea it might be over. But once the second one was dropped, then we didn't know but what we had a whole host of those bombs. They didn't either. That's why we dropped the second one. And maybe we didn't have another one quite yet, but they didn't know that. And so this is why finally the emperor interceded, and once he spoke, they judged to lay down their arms. And when we went in, I went in early and helped to disarm the Japanese. The Japanese on the street corner bowed down to us, literally, which surprised us. And here again, like the World War II veterans taking over our country for 40 years, we were 19, 20. By that time, most of us probably were 19, 20 rather than 17 and 18 when we started. We were taking over that country. We were commandeering the trains. I rode on trains, buses, cars. We'd take anything we wanted. They would just get out. If we came along, we'd take over. And we went into the caves. They had materials in those caves. They had Baka bombs. They had parachute factories. They had everything under the sun, and we pulled all that out and destroyed it. That was a big part of what we were doing. And then, of course, we also, I was at the old Japanese naval base at Yokosuka. It really was at Opama. And I only found one other Marine that ever served at Oldham after I left there, because it became an industrial site later. But we took over the Japanese naval base. We'd fly right down the strip over Tokyo Bay, which reminds me of one day we just had an engine change. We went up over and one engine cut out. And that old plane on one engine going just like that down over the water. And I mean, the pilot, he gunned her up. It stayed there for about 3 or 4 minutes, and finally gained enough to roll back and come back. We went back and parked and said, who left the carburetor off this thing? And it left a bolt off a carburetor. But here again, life is a thin line. Mm-hmm. You don't have to get shot. But even my knowledge of Iwo Jima, so many of my friends were there. Mm-hmm. You could go in there and stay the whole time and come out without a wound. Or you could be getting off the boat and get killed. And so combat isn't how long you were there when you came in. It's the luck of the draw. And that's the way it was. And last year, I may have told you this, I went back to Iwo Jima with 11 other Marines from World War II, and the other 11 had actually landed there. 6 of them had been wounded there. And we stood up on top Mount Sarah, and of course I'm a member of the Iwo Jima survivors by virtue of my having survived that crash there. We were up on Mount Suribachi, and we had 12 students from Ohio State studying history by being there with the Marines. And these guys say, well, my buddy, was right down there in that foxhole, he was shot and killed. And then somebody else, well, they were getting off the boat over here, and this guy fell over the side of the boat, and another boat crushed him. I mean, these were the kinds of things that were coming out, which to young men of today, that's not what they think about combat, or they don't quite know what it is all about. But it's that sort of thing going on, and they did that. And one of the students said, you guys were younger when you were here doing that, and we are as juniors in college, which is true. And it's almost incomprehensible when you think of it today, of the young people of today, but they could do it if they had to do it. But you do in life what life asks you to do, and that's the nature of humanity, which is a lesson.
That's very well said, and I think here you are, at this point in, knowing that you were going into Japan. Suddenly you're going into Japan under totally different circumstances, right? So now you're in a post-war environment, and
within a matter of a few days, couple of weeks.
Couple of weeks. Talk about that transformation. You talked a little bit about the reception, but really walk me through. Let's sort of visualize what you're coming into Japan. What did you see? What were your first impressions?
Went through that typhoon on the way. Came out of that, pulled into Tokyo Bay. I'll never forget thinking, there is Japan, that country that we've been fighting. We're right here next to it, nobody's shooting at us. Japanese ships in the harbor, our ships in the harbor, moving in to unload, getting off and standing on Japanese soil. I remember what an impression it was to me. Why were we fighting a war? Here are these people, here's their country, here we are, nobody's shooting at us. We have all these people killed. Why'd they ever start this war? I mean, those are things that came to me as one of the members of the team of fighting each other. And then we got off and got transportation and started moving through the countryside. We had on some small roads, along those roads, were the Japanese houses and communities. Didn't look to be disturbed at all. Then we came into Tokyo. I hadn't yet seen Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Tokyo was almost as devastated as those two countries. It was literally blown apart, burned to the ground. Now there were a few things like the Emperor's area that we had we did not want to destroy. There were a few shells of buildings more than at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. There are a couple of shells there too, but these incendiary bombs, and I thought to myself then, people wonder why we would drop one bomb and destroy a city. And I thought, why wouldn't it be more humane to do that than to have dropped these incendiary bombs for months? And these people were running into the rivers to get away from the heat and were boiled alive, and all that actually happened there. And we isolate the atom bomb as something inhumane, and the rest of it we kind of accept it because the Germans did this to London, and we did this to Berlin, and the Japanese did this to Pearl Harbor, and we trade off, so we accept that. And I guess it's why we who fought the Pacific and who maybe were in Hiroshima and Nagasaki later cannot conceive of this question in the minds of some people, naysayers of today who weren't there, whose lives weren't at stake, thinking how terrible it was for us to drop one bomb to kill all these people. I don't care how many bombs. Might as well get one, get it over with. If you're going to burn them to death day after day after day, I think it's more punishment that way than the other. So I really don't see one as different from the other. And Yokohama, Tokyo, every Japanese city, well, the industrial cities, Yokosuka, not so much there. We bypassed a couple of their historical cities, and we had bypassed it too. We dropped the bomb so we could test out the bomb there. But so when I went to Hiroshima, I was not so shocked. I'd already been to Tokyo and Yokohama, so I just accepted it the other way around. But I get a 10% disability today because I was there. The World War I was mustard gas, and you got a disability from being in the military if you were associated with mustard. In Vietnam, it was Agent Orange. I get 10% because if you were, while the ashes were still hot, we walked through that thing. We didn't have any idea there was any problem there, that radioactivity existed. Nobody told us. We just went into the town and surveyed the situation and occupied. And up to now, my wife kids me about lighting up at 3 o'clock in the morning, but other than that.
Well, let's talk about your initial impressions, because I mean, again, you saw Tokyo destroyed, and so Hiroshima was not as dramatic, but still, you see the photo. We see the photographs, and we just see flattened, and then there's that iconic photograph with the building with the dome. And it's just flattened, and then there's that partial building with the dome.
I'm just back at the dome last year.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, describe what you saw when you were sort of walking through.
Of course, I came in by air and landed right. I don't remember whether it's a strip or just an open area there. That old R4D we had, we'd land in cow pastures anywhere, and. But I saw it, and again, I had heard all the devastation, and I realized it was. And I thought, how could one bomb do that? I knew what hundreds of bombs could do. So I wasn't so much thinking, this is a more terrible thing. I was thinking, how fascinating that one bomb can do this. Maybe we can end wars because people know that there's no end to what can be done in short order. And hopefully that's the psychology of why we haven't had any big wars since, because each country is going to blow up everybody else's city. And so what do you gain by that? That's why we don't want Iran. They don't care. They want to die anyway, and apparently go to heaven and get those virgins and what have you. But the reality of it was both shocking and, I'll use a word on the other side if I can think of it, satisfying in the sense of knowing we had the kind of power that might prevent war. So I wasn't thinking about devastation by our power, but having something that would offset the prospect of future wars. Not thinking at the time, well, everybody's going to have one, but even there, you hope that it'll provide for us maintaining a civil position and not trying to go to war. But again, you get out, walk through the city, and you see close up the river, nothing around it, and realize that there, right after the bomb was dropped, it was floating the corpses of thousands of people. Then I remembered also in Tokyo, the river there, and the story is very vividly portrayed in some of the publications. Once they dropped those fire bombs, there was no place to go. You couldn't get away from the heat, so they jumped into the river, and the river boiled. It was so strong, the heat was unbearable. And I thought about all that, and I made those comparisons. And I think even as a young man, I'm trying to think whether I guess I was still 19 years old. I'm sure I wasn't more than that. I was probably beyond 18. How destructive, how unreal, why did this have to happen? But I never went beyond the belief that we weren't the guilty ones, and I still feel that way. Mm-hmm. That we were attacked, we continued to be attacked. We tried to defend ourselves, and the attacks kept coming. And if we took over an island, they fought viciously, and they had taken it from somebody else, and we weren't without some guilt, certainly, because there's no way, there's always two sides to everything. But as a member of our country, as a member of the military, I had to believe that what I was doing was meritorious for my country, and I don't care if the Japanese and the Germans feel the same way. That's all right with me if they're fighting for their country. An incident that made that more clear to me, one of my daughters was with the Defense Department in Germany for 20 years as a teacher. After she graduated the University of Richmond, she married a German. They had a child. He lives now in Richmond. And his father was a German fighter pilot during World War II. Well, after the marriage, he and I became acquainted. Here is the grandfather on this side of the son and one on this side, different sides during the war. Well, we became very warm friends, and his own family said he talked to me a lot more about his involvement as a German fighter pilot than he ever talked to them, because he was talking to someone who was in the military, and we both thought in terms of fighting for our country. He was not a Nazi in that sense of the word. He didn't care about Hitler one way or the other, but he was flying his plane and shooting down allies if he could. Well, he still had a little two-seater plane, so he put me in the back seat, and we went up and flew all over the mountains over there in Germany, and he turned loose and gave me the stick, and I got to fly with him. Then he came down, and he had another buddy who had flown with him who took the plane, hooked his glider up, and I went up with him in his glider. We've glided around those mountains over there. So here again, after the fact, you're friends again. The Japanese, the Germans are our close allies, and it's unpredictable in this world and in this life and in history. And to understand humanity, you have to understand history. You know, we're just a small part of it. And we reproduce actions in different ways because we have different rifles, different mobility, different means of getting there. The difference between a troop ship and an airplane that they have today. It's a difference in the life of a soldier or of the military person.
I mean, who would have thought that?
Who would have believed it?
Toyota would come to Kentucky, at that time.
Yeah.
That Kentucky would have an enormous Japanese, population.
Oh, absolutely. And the Japanese are such warm, friendly people. I have pictures of Japanese families I visited. I have often said, one thing that I'm very pleased with, I was in Japan for 8 months, and I became acquainted after we've settled down with Japanese families. I sat in their home and ate some of their food, and one Japanese naval officer gave me his dress sword. I have it at the Virginia War Memorial in a case they have of all my memorabilia there, and still pictures of the children of the Japanese people and so forth. And I lost my hatred. I have Marine friends today who still hate the Japanese. And if you go back to Guadalcanal, and they hung Marines up and desecrated their bodies totally, and I'm sure we did some of the things. I didn't. I don't know any Marines who really did that, but the hatred was so strong. But they taught us to hate them. How do you ram a bayonet in somebody's stomach? You don't see them as inhuman. You almost have to do that. They felt the same way about us. But that's all over, and we have Japanese students, Chinese students, German students, and it's all a mixture of learning together. But you look back, there are very few people in the society today, and again, I say at 86, I'm among the younger combat veterans of World War II, and most of them are in their 90s now, or about gone. What we have and what we think about today is a lot of that stuff that is a foundation of our thinking today. It's in our minds. It affects how we think, why we think that way. We have mellowed. We have overcome certain prejudices brought on by that for that time. Everybody has prejudices from the period of history in which they live. There's no one without prejudice, no matter how much we defend the fact that we don't have any. We used to call it principle. Stood on principle. You can't stand on principle anymore. You can't be prejudiced. But we all have to live with how we deal with that.
Well, let's talk about coming home. So you were in Japan for 8 months. What next?
Okay, I was in Japan 8 months, and I was flying with a crew of Marines. We had a great friendship. We, by this time, had been in the Marine Corps over 2 years and overseas for a year at least, and trained and matured. As I said, I had grown 4 inches taller, and I was a man by this time. We were, what are we going to do next? Here we were. We hadn't decided to go to college or not. Some of us had. I hadn't. In fact, I had not even thought about going. I had written to my mother and said, I've had all the education I can stand, so I'm sure not going to college. And this was even after the war. So we sat around one evening. I don't know whether we were drinking coffee or beer or whatever. We had enough to talk, Let's just ship over. Well, we don't know what we're going to do. Let's just ship over in the Corps and maybe make a career of it. Well, that sounded like they had a little something going on too. Said if you guys, they wanted us to ship over. We were mature, and we had specialties, and of course the Marine Corps was going to continue to exist, and we could be promoted. And they said also, if anybody who ships over, we'll fly you back to the States. You don't have to take a ship back. Man, that was pretty good, because I never hardly, except on my aircraft, I hadn't flown across the ocean. Had those old 4-engine MAPs, Marine Air Transports, and Navy Air Transports. So a few days later, 3 of us, I believe, at that time, all shipped over for 2 years together. Got on an airplane, flew in back to San Diego. 36 hours, we stopped at Guam, Midway, Honolulu to refuel. Just buzzed on those bucket seats all the way across. But it'd beat another 56 days on a troop ship or whatever they'd take. Landed in San Diego. They assigned us to Quantico, Virginia, but gave us 60 days leave. So a guy from Cincinnati, and I was from Louisville at the time, or Oldham County. We decided we'd hitchhike back then we didn't have civilian clothes. If you're in the military, you wore a uniform all the time. So we had our Marine Corps had issued me a new set of dress blues. We started out on old Route 66 for Louisville. We hitchhiked for 3 or 4 days, maybe 4 or 5 days. And back then, in uniform, people would pick you up, tell you what a great job you did, how much they appreciated we won the war. We'd sleep in the back seat of their car, stop on the corner and thumb, and they'd come get us, take us to our house and feed us. That's the kind of way it was. Everybody was proud to have the veterans coming home. So we did our 60-day leave. I fell in love, got engaged to a young lady who, when I had left 2 years earlier, she was too young for me and I was too small to be thinking about that anyway. So she was from LaGrange, and we spent that 2 months courting. So in the meantime, my friend bought a car, a Nash, a second-hand Nash. Drove down from Cincinnati to Louisville and picked me up. We were going to drive back to Quantico. So we're going through those West Virginia hills where the Cork curves meet each other, and big mountain coming down halfway, and flagmen stopped us. They were working on the road. We stopped. All of a sudden, he started frantically waving his flag. And I looked back, and here comes a truckload of feed. We had passed him, and he was, I probably had said something about, looked like a drunk driver or something. So here he comes, and before we could move, he plowed into the back of us, knocked us over the mountain. We started tumbling and rolling, and I'm thinking, I'm still alive. I hope I stay that way. And we finally hit a tree, and it blocked us. And I remember we were on our side, and I saw that truck coming down the mountain. And the door flew open, and the body landed on our car, and the truck landed on the body. And it was a 4-door sedan, and the only way we could get out of that car was through the trunk. And the 2 guys in the truck were dead. My friend was taken to the hospital, and I was bruised and bleeding, and I hitchhiked on to Quantico. Checked in. 2 weeks later, he showed up from the hospital. The insurance company paid him for the car in full. We went to Washington, bought 2 Harley-Davidson motorcycles because we said we could get out of them better than we could a car if something happened. So that's safety on that side. So that's how we started our 2 years furlough. And then during that period of time, he married, the other guy married. One of them had twins during that time. They took me from Quantico to Cherry Point, North Carolina. I was assigned to, as a sergeant in charge of all the transmitter equipment for the crash crews. You know, aircraft, a lot of aircraft flying out of there, and they crash every once in a while, and we have all this equipment. And I was assigned the responsibility for all that and spent most of those 2 years in that activity, and was up for staff sergeant, just about ready to be promoted, and perhaps might have stayed in. And I saw on the bulletin board that the Marine Corps was willing to give an early discharge to anybody who wanted to go to college. Well, up to then, I hadn't decided to go to college, and I had read that bulletin. And I thought, man, you know what? I might flunk out, but maybe I'll give that a try. So I applied to the Marine Corps for early discharge. They gave it to me. I drove back to Kentucky. I had bought, by the way, on heavy credit, a brand new 1947 Ford Club Coupe. My cousin was a Ford dealer here in LaGrange, and he took me down to, they built them in Louisville, and he took me down, we took one off of the assembly line, and I'd driven it back. So I got my car and came back to Kentucky, went up on the farm with my dad and ma for a couple of days, and then I checked with Georgetown College. I didn't have enough high school credits. And a fellow Marine who was with me on Okinawa, who was in a foxhole for 4 months over there, had written to me and said, I am at Campbellsville College, a little junior college, and I'm finishing here 2 years. why don't you get out, and this is probably what caused me to look at that bulletin board, why don't you get out of the Marine Corps and come down here to go to school? They'll take you. So I went down there, signed up. They took me, moved into a barracks of 16 veterans, an old wooden barracks they'd gotten from an Army base somewhere. So 16 of us, probably none of us deserved to be in college. But we went, all the camaraderie, we'd drink coffee and smoke cigarettes and talk about how we get through all this stuff and carry our, they were Army, Navy, Marines, all kind. And that's how I started my college education. And the GI Bill gave us clean sheets to use, and I've forgotten how much a month, but enough. I sold my car because I started dating a young lady, and we decided to get married. Now, this is the first quarter I was in school. I met her at she was serving in the food services, gave me a piece of chocolate pie, and she came back around. I said, I'd like another piece of that chocolate pie. She said we could only give one. But she came back with another piece after that, said it was hers. So I thought, well, this young lady's giving me the second piece of chocolate pie. I'll ask her for a date. 2 weeks later, I asked her to marry me. 3 months later, we were married, and I was still a freshman in college. And before I got my doctorate, we had 6 kids, so you can see but that's all a part, again, of the maturity level of the veterans. They were all getting married and having kids and going to school, really didn't think that much about it. So I went, before we finished that 2-year college, we had a baby and lost the first one. And, but I made a 3.8 average, which for me was, man, I was on my way. Then I applied to Vanderbilt and got in, and the rest of it's my educational career, I guess. But that's kind of the way it was, all happenstance and almost by luck. But the GI Bill, the government, I give the government credit. I may disdain the government. I don't want the government interfering with too much. But there are things the government can do to help its citizens to do better, to serve the government, to pay their taxes, to make the government what it ought to be, not something that interferes with our lives, but that helps our lives to advance to a point we can take over and succeed. But that's kind of the way that happened, and the rest of it's been walking through the doors as they opened. I never have decided what I want to be yet.
Well, there's plenty of time. And
so I gave up the motorcycle when I come back to college.
oh,
Never rode on one again until I was 71. My 11 grandchildren had all but been educated, and I'd helped do that. My kids had been educated. My wife presented me with a brand new red Harley Road King.
wow, that's amazing. And you've been riding.
And I
ever
was
since?
71 years old.
That's amazing. And you ride ever since?
Been riding ever since. I traded in at 81, and I tell people, I've literally done this. I've got one asking for a new one at 91. So
absolutely.
Plan to do that.
Oh, that's fantastic. That is fantastic. Well, go back to Campbellsville for a minute. And we've got these veterans. You talked about the barracks. A lot of veterans today, when they come back to college campuses, I've interviewed several of them. One of the difficulties is there is no community for them. They're going to campus and they're sitting in class, and there's these undergrads next to them who think, I'm going to die if I don't pass this math test, and they've got a different perspective.
Yeah.
And in some ways that's a struggle, but it sounds like to me there was a sense of community among the veterans. Were you all talking about your experience 5 years ago?
We talked to each other about our experiences. We didn't talk to other people. Yeah. You hear those old stories, still true. My dad never mentioned his service. Mm-hmm. My granddad never talked about it. My husband never talked about it. Well, how do you talk about something people don't know what you're talking about? Mm-hmm. When we went back to Iwo Jima, all of us old Marines now in our 80s, 90s, we reverted back to being 18 and 19. We all started talking about things we each knew about. So we didn't have to talk to these students. We talked to each other. We probably wouldn't have talked to the students. They wouldn't have understood. Now I'm going to be up at Ohio State talking to students, I mentioned soon. And these are students, some of them who went with us, I'm sure. But yeah, we sat around, drank coffee, and smoked cigarettes. All of us in the military smoked, you know. And I didn't quit till I was 35, I guess. I always wanted to quit, but I had to have it. But we'd sit around and we'd go down to the corner drugstore and smoke and drink coffee and talk about how we were doing, or which girl we dated, or you know, do you miss being over here in so-and-so, or this girl I dated when I was in San Diego, and we just talked to each other about life as we knew it, because talking to these freshman kids of 17 years old, we're 21, somebody asked me about joining the fraternity. I said, yeah, listen, I'm in the Marine Corps, that's my fraternity. I don't need a fraternity. But those were the distinctive differences.
And those 3 years of difference there between, you know, in terms of the ages, a few years of difference were, you know, in reality,
it was 10
decades.
years of maturity,
Yeah.
10 years of experience,
Yeah.
really. I saw an article not too long ago that said just that. Someone who's been in the military under the circumstances we were probably equivalent of 30 years of age. Mm-hmm. Because you were forced fed. And that's why all these thousands of flyers could fly these bombers over everywhere. You don't think about today, take a kid 19 and at 21 he can fly a big transport plane somewhere. You got to do it, go at 10 for years and get all that experience and what have you. But we enjoyed each other's company. We dated together. In fact, I remember there were 4 of us veterans who took our girlfriends to see Gone with the Wind. That was kind of new back then. It's a long time ago, 66 or 7 years ago. And it was playing at Greensboro, which is from Campbellsville, not too far. And one of the guys had, well, we had 2 cars. I had my car. So 4 of us in each car. Well, the movie went on beyond midnight. And this little Baptist school, you know, they had rules. You had to be in by midnight or sooner, these girls. Well, we veterans, we didn't get them in time. So we knew they'd be campused. So we took our 2 cars and we parked somewhere and all slept in the car all night. And the next morning, we went back on campus, went to the dining room for breakfast. And then they went from breakfast back to their rooms. Nobody knew that they were late. So we were learning things were changing at the college. When we first went there, they'd catch you holding a hand, you know, and they'd say, oh, we're going to campus you. You hold hands now, what are you going to do when you're married? I mean, those are the kind of attitudes back then. But when I infiltrated the place with a bunch of veterans, it was a very different, things changed.
That's brilliant, actually. That's really
but that
amazing.
was reality. And then that barracks burned down the next semester with all of everything. All my clothes burned up. The only thing I had left, my dress blues, I left at my dad's place. And I had these dress blue breeches. So I took the red stripe off and I wore those breeches all through college.
Yeah.
It worked just as well as buying a new pair. We didn't have much money.
Did you get any kind of how did the faculty react to this new kind of student that they were facing?
I'll tell you, I could tell you a number of instances there, but later when I was a junior at Peabody College at Vanderbilt, they had a Canadian professor, an old guy that he was tremendous. He is a great teacher. The only one I think I made a C in after I had gotten straightened out. But when I got that C, along came a note. And he said, an old Marine can do better than this. Come into my office and let me help you. That was the kind of attitude that they had. And he did help me, and I elevated my grade. But in junior college, they treated us like men. Differently, really. I mean, it wasn't that obvious, but we knew it. And I remember I got to know the president of that little junior college, he presided at the wedding of my wife and me, because of course she was a student, I was a student. And I gave him my last $10 after the wedding. The next day he gave it back to me. He said, "You need this worse than I do." he knew it and I knew it. But we were flat broke, but we had a budget of $1 a day eating. She worked at the little 10-cent store, I believe, downtown, for 10 cents an hour, and she was pregnant, and she was ill part of that time. I worked at building furniture at a little furniture factory for 12 cents an hour. Of course, I had a GI Bill, but I was making payments on that car, paying rent. We lived in a little Army mobile home that even for newlyweds was too small. You passed each other. You couldn't hardly get by each other in that little tiny thing. I think we paid $16 a month. And they were down in a circle, kind of like the Alamo. And they had an outside toilet, outside showers. Well, they had a building. It was a community thing. In the wintertime, the water was cold. I mean, it was archaic, this little school. They didn't have any money either. But we had 198 students there. Today, it's got 3,500, and it's a university. And I don't know whether I mentioned it earlier, but my wife and I are honorary chairs of the campaign. We're kicking off Monday, in fact. And we were very active there because she was there on a work scholarship because her mother had died, and there were 6 of them in the family, and she was the oldest. So she had to have help. And I was there on probation. So that school saw us both through, and it has benefited from our involvement. I do everything I can for it today because, you know, what you get at a time you need it, you never forget.
Yeah. I mean, it clearly shaped your direction.
Oh, absolutely.
And opened many doors for you.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Well, talk about, you know, I think this interview is focusing on your World War II experience, but clearly after getting out, you've risen to an incredible career in higher education and several leadership positions. And one of the things that this seems to be a theme is leadership, and talk about the effect that something like your experience in the military has on taking you to the point of being a university president, chancellor, and
yeah. I mentioned earlier that I had done an article for the Navy Proceedings monthly publication recently about how my Marine Corps, or my military experience, but for me it was a Marine, others the Navy and Army and Air Force, had affected my professional career, and I cited that. And I had a title to it. They did away with my title, and they titled it, "I Grew Up in the Marine Corps." Well, I literally did, and that's a part of why it has affected me professionally so much, because without that period of growing under the circumstance of challenge, responsibility, standards that were set for me, success, and to me, that 4 years, whether it was on the rifle range where I exceeded far beyond those older and more mature, stronger, or whatever else, more advanced, or whether it was the 4 years of growing up and having leadership opportunity, which I did. I had troops under me, maybe 20 or 30 young Marines, younger than I, and in a lesser position when I was a sergeant, that I was responsible for. They recognized my responsibility because it wasn't a question of that I was older than them, smarter than them, or anything. I had stripes on my arm, and I was a Marine sergeant, and they knew it. And I knew it. And I knew that I couldn't take advantage of that. I had to live up to that, and that they were dependent upon me to give them guidance. And that is the essence of leadership in anything. It's all human relations. Now, in the military, you can call it dictatorial if you want to, The general can dictate to the colonel and right on down the line. But you don't survive and thrive and succeed in that fashion and in that mode. It is not by mandate, it is by influence that you need to get things done. Motivation, passion that people recognize with legitimacy and ethical standards, unselfish position of authority, using your authority to help others, not to restrain them, give them opportunity because you have the option of doing that. And those above you, observing that, they understand that. And you move forward by how you deal with others more than why you deal out of your own ambitions. Now, you have to be ambitious to succeed at anything, and we can't apologize for that, you know. You're successful because you're ambitious. Each of the three of us in our way. But you cannot be blindly ambitious, overlooking the ambition of others, the options of others, the capabilities of others, how others make you successful the way you are, as I will subscribe to the fact the government does. Maybe you don't do it by yourself, but the government doesn't do it by itself either. You have more to do with it than the government does, ultimately, because you've got a long period of time in which to succeed. Along the way, the government can intercede, but now you're succeeding, you'll pay the taxes, you pay the government to be able to do that. Well, I'm getting into a different arena here. But my leadership would have been non-existent in the sense that I have been able to apply it without the Marine Corps. Confidence probably is the number one thing it gave me. Still today, when I rode around the country 9,200 miles, what's the one word I've heard more than any other? Well, after all, he's a Marine. At 86, he's a Marine. You know, that's an impression that you get from something you did and you experience that people respect. And that throughout the world, the United States Marine Corps, that does in any way detract from the Army Special Forces is distinctive. The Navy SEALs is distinctive. The term Marine, you know, you're not in the Navy, you're a sailor, an officer in the Army, you're a soldier, you're a Marine. It doesn't matter what you are. It's a title that gives you that. That's built in you. That gives you confidence. You believe in yourself because you measured up at some point to something beyond what you could ever have done on your own without somebody laying the standard, and you, like doing pull-ups, you know, so many, and you get to a certain place and you remember that. So the environment, the atmosphere, the title, the visibility, the responsibility, all those terms came out in my maturing in a 4-year period and then continued. Just like I mentioned, I was teaching college students after flunking out of high school and coming through a little junior college. I was in my first semester, my senior year, finishing, and the head of the department came to me and said, Professor so-and-so is leaving. I've got mathematics of accounting and intermediate accounting and nobody to teach it. I want you to teach it. I said, Professor, I don't even have a college degree. He said, I know that, but you've taken 2 of my courses, and I know you can do it, and we'll pay you what we pay the faculty. I said, well, I'll do anything for money. Back in those days, I needed the money. So he assigned me the course. I said, well, I haven't taken either one of those courses. He said, well, I know you can handle it, and that's why you don't have to take them. So I stayed 10 pages ahead of the students and taught the 2 courses, earned the money, and then after I finished my undergraduate, he said, stay on and take a master's degree and teach those 2 courses. So I did that, and that really, I guess that was probably my foundation ultimately in getting into higher education, though I really went in after going into public accounting for almost 2 years as the chief financial officer of a college, where on the side, when I was at Kentucky Wesleyan, General Electric had a big plant there. And they had the middle managers who had graduated from college without too much knowledge of accounting and that kind of fiscal stuff that you need in management business. So I taught evening programs for those executives, and I remember they're saying, we learn more from you because you're the chief financial officer of college. You've been in public accounting, auditing people. You've taught it, and we understand it a whole lot better than we do this guy who's done none of that but just teaches from the book. Well, you get different perspectives and you give different perspectives. Other opportunities, and those were just a part of beyond one aspect of your life where you have a foundation for success. Every step you take, it's like one of the person from the past, I'm a great on poetry to state my case. The rung of a ladder was never meant to rest upon, but only to hold one's foot higher so he can take one step higher. So the day you rest on the ladder, you know you're going back downhill. So every aspect of my life has been like yours. I'm not talking about myself, both of you in your business. You advance by the knowledge you have. It's like the society and history. We move on from this big room full of computers down to our little iPhones because it's progress. We move from the Model T to the Cadillac of today by progress. But if we didn't have the Model T, we wouldn't have this. So I see my life as that, and yet today, still happening every day. I learn something every day. I deal with students, I deal with faculty. I have, because of where I am, I can be helpful to someone. A few others could perhaps provide that knowledge, incentive, inspiration, or whatever else. And somebody else will be beneficial to me. My grandchildren, they keep me wise on my computer or whatever else. You know, I call them up to get their advice and counsel. And I've had numerous letters from people who ride motorcycles saying, you know, I'm 60 years old. I was about to give up my motorcycle. After reading about you, I intend to ride a long time. You know, maybe my wife and my daughter have told me I'll give that up. I'm not about to. So you set an example almost by accident, but if you've been successful in what you're doing, that accident's okay. You know, you say, well, it's not bragging if you've done it, I guess.
I'm going to shift gears a little bit because I think that's a great way to sort of cap off your story. And I'm going to ask a bit of a selfish question because, you know, we do interact a lot with veterans, young veterans coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan who are now entering into higher education. And you are a leader in higher education and understand this world greatly. And I think as we sort of reflect on this generation that is now coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan in large numbers, many of which are struggling with that transition, what advice would you give to these veterans transitioning back into society, but then we'll make the move and talk about transitioning into higher education?
I would say, and I do, I have opportunity to do this, to say to them, keep moving forward and being educated. Don't give up whatever the obstacles may seem to be, because they really don't exist that strongly. You know, you can knock them down as you go along. And that extends to the veterans who have the syndrome that comes from the war for whatever reasons and however they received it. I was in Honolulu meeting and I've done this other places as well, with Vietnam veterans, particularly the Vietnam veterans. I met with probably 30 or 40 of them, and then I met with another group of wounded Marines in Honolulu for 3 or 4 hours in kind of a therapy session. Some other World War II veterans were with me, interacting with them on why it appeared, and this was the question, that World War II veterans didn't have all these problems. Well, we cited the fact that, number one, probably, not as many World War II veterans who were wounded survived. On Iwo Jima, if you were wounded, there weren't helicopters take you out. So you probably, unless it was relatively, if you had a leg blown off, you were dead. We got a lot of kids with legs blown off today. They were helicoptered out. Now they've got to be rehabilitated. And so they have a different thing to overcome than lots of, well, we do have some World War II, certainly, but not the numbers today. We also cite to them that there were 16 million of us. We didn't have anybody to complain to. We couldn't complain to each other. We were ashamed to complain to somebody. Would say, "Oh, Joe, shut up. We all been through that. Quit feeling sorry for yourself." That kind of camaraderie, again, like in college, we didn't sit around and, man, I can't sleep at night and all that kind of stuff. Well, I guess we've all lost some sleep at night, what have you. But to whom do you complain? Today, there seem to be more places to complain, but we don't talk to them in the sense that we're belittling what they're feeling, that they really don't have it. We can't put ourselves in their place, and we say that. But we also say, how did we deal with this? Most of us came out, went to work, went to school. We got busy. We were ambitious. We wanted to succeed. And that's overpowering, really. Today, tomorrow I may be dead or have a heart attack, but people say, why at this age can you ride a motorcycle? Why should I feel so healthy? I don't know, but I think more than anything else is, I don't have time to feel otherwise. I don't think about whether I'm capable of getting up this morning at 4 o'clock or riding off on my motorcycle somewhere. Until I do, why should I cease to do the things that I feel good about doing? I might as well set the example, which I strive to do. So I share, and we have a veterans program at the University of Richmond. The law school in particular, they're a little more mature veterans, but they're older and there. We have a veterans program at Campbellsville, and I've got a case there, a lot of my memorabilia in the building named for me at Campbellsville. And so wherever I am, I'm always engaged some way in interacting with veterans. And I always let it be known that I'm one of the fortunate ones, which to the large extent, and people sometimes don't realize this, you take the 16 million of veterans of World War II, most of us came back. Maybe 500,000 were killed outright, maybe 500,000 were wounded. Most of us came back whole. A few maybe were psychologically damaged. I had one Marine that went back to Iwo Jima with me, and I've come to know very well. He landed on 4 islands, was wounded on Iwo. He said after being back, he said, I got back now 68 years later, and I realized it was real. It almost had become a dream. And now I feel better, I can sleep better. Well, that's one reason we go back. We, as the Greatest Generation Foundation, we take these veterans back to where they were in combat for therapeutic reasons. So some of them did have their problems, but not to the extent that the society seems today to believe these veterans ought to have these problems. Some of it may be just that. But who am I to say they don't have serious problems? So I sympathize, empathize, but I also do my best to share the fact that whatever my 4 years experience may have left with me, I try to present it as positive, and my life as ongoing, and my health. I don't want to stop and worry about my health. I take a few pills. I mean, the doctor told me to, so I do. I don't know that I need them. But you feel healthy, you don't get old, or you don't quit doing things because you get old because you quit doing things. And I share that philosophy, and I believe it very much. So that's a part of it, not only working with veterans, but with older people. And that's kind of my message. And when they ask me why I'm healthy, I think I'm healthy because I don't really know whether I am or not. I just feel good.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us.
Well, it's been a
and
pleasure.
Share your story.